Marcus Chen had always been the type of person who lived for the perfect social media moment. At 28 years old, he had built a modest following on his video platform by pulling harmless pranks and capturing funny reactions from strangers around the world. His trips were carefully planned around locations that would give him the best content, and London had been on his list for months. The historic city, with its grand architecture and traditional ceremonies, seemed like the perfect backdrop for his next viral video. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early October when Marcus stood outside Buckingham Palace, his phone fully charged and his coffee cup strategically placed in his backpack. He had arrived at dawn to scout the location. Watching the changing of the guard ceremony from a distance and planning his approach, the palace grounds were already filling with tourists. Cameras clicking and children pointing excitedly at the tall guardsmen in their iconic red uniforms and bearskin hats. Marcus had done his research, or so he thought. He knew the guards were famous for their stoic expressions and unwavering discipline. Videos of tourists trying to make them laugh or break character had millions of views online. But Marcus wanted something different, something that would truly stand out from the endless stream of tourist content. He wanted a reaction that no one had captured before, something that would make his video impossible to scroll past. The plan seemed simple enough in his mind. He would approach one of the guards during a quiet moment, pretend to trip, and splash his coffee near them without actually hitting them directly. The shock value would be perfect. The guard's reaction would be priceless. He would quickly apologize and explain it was just for a video. Everyone would laugh it off, and he would have his viral moment. What could possibly go wrong with a harmless prank like that? As the morning progressed, Marcus positioned himself near the perimeter where one of the guards stood at attention. The guard was a tall man, probably in his mid-30s, the stern face barely visible beneath the shadow of his ceremonial hat. His rifle was held perfectly vertical, his posture rigid and professional. Marcus felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. He had pulled dozens of pranks before, and they had all worked out fine. Marcus pulled out his large coffee cup, making sure his phone was already recording in his jacket pocket. The camera angle was perfect, capturing both him and the guard in the frame. Other tourists milled around, taking photos and chatting in various languages. The atmosphere was relaxed and jovial, exactly what Marcus needed. He took a deep breath, rehearsing his fake stumble in his mind one more time. Then he made his move. Marcus walked toward the guard with exaggerated casualness, pretending to look at something on his phone while holding the coffee cup loosely in his other hand. As he got within a few feet of the guardsman, he executed what he thought was a convincing stumble. Lurching forward and flinging the contents of his cup directly at the guard's pristine red uniform, the lukewarm coffee splashed across the guard's chest and legs, dark stains immediately spreading across the bright red fabric. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The chatter of nearby tourists died down as heads turned toward the commotion. Marcus stood there with an empty cup and what he hoped was an apologetic expression, waiting for the guard's shocked reaction that would make his video gold. But the guard did not flinch. He did not blink. His expression remained completely unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. His eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused on any particular point, maintaining the same discipline he had shown all morning. Marcus felt his confidence waver slightly. This was not the reaction he had expected. Before Marcus could say anything, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Two other guards who had been positioned nearby were no longer at their posts. They were walking toward him with purposeful strides, their faces no longer neutral but showing clear intent. Behind them, a palace security officer in a dark suit was speaking urgently into a radio. Marcus suddenly realized that his harmless prank might not have been perceived as harmless at all. His heart began to race as the reality of the situation crashed over him like a wave. He was not at a public park or a shopping mall where he could laugh off a silly stunt and walk away. He was at one of the most protected and respected locations in the United Kingdom. And he had just assaulted one of the Queen's guards on duty. The two approaching guards reached him in seconds. Their hands firmly grasped his arms, not roughly but with undeniable authority. Marcus tried to speak to explain that it was just a joke for a video, but one of the guards cut him off with a stern command to remain silent. The security officer arrived moments later, his expression cold and professional. Within minutes, Marcus found himself being escorted away from the public area, away from the crowds of confused tourists who were now filming him with their own phones. His mind raced with panicked thoughts. This was supposed to be funny. This was supposed to go viral for the right reasons. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? As they moved him through a side entrance into a building adjacent to the palace grounds, Marcus caught a glimpse of the guard he had targeted. The man had not moved from his position, still standing at perfect attention despite the coffee staining his uniform. Another guard was approaching with what looked like a replacement, preparing for a discreet uniform change. The professionalism and seriousness of the situation finally hit Marcus with full force. He was led into a small, austere room with plain walls and a simple table with 2 chairs. The security officer gestured for him to sit, and Marcus complied immediately. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The officer stood by the door, speaking quietly into his radio while Marcus sat alone with his thoughts. The weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders, the door opened again, and a woman in a formal suit entered, carrying a tablet and a folder. She introduced herself as Detective Inspector Sarah Whitmore from the Metropolitan Police. Her tone was professional, but carried an edge that made Marcus's stomach drop even further. She sat across from him and placed the folder on the table between them. Detective Whitmore explained that assaulting a member of the King's Guard was a serious criminal offense, not a prank or a joke. The guards were active military personnel on official duty, and any attack on them, regardless of intent, was treated with the utmost severity. Marcus tried to interject to explain about the video in his social media channel, but the detective raised a hand to stop him. She informed him that he was being detained for questioning, and that charges would likely be filed. The incident had been captured by multiple security cameras from various angles, and there were dozens of witnesses. His own phone, which was still recording in his pocket, would be seized as evidence. Marcus felt his world crumbling around him. What had started as a quest for online fame had turned into a potential criminal record in a foreign country. As Detective Whitmore began her formal questioning, asking for his full name, passport details, and the reason for his visit to the United Kingdom, Marcus could only think about how spectacularly he had miscalculated. The story he thought he would be telling his followers about his epic viral moment was turning into a cautionary tale about the consequences of seeking attention at any cost. And this was only the beginning of what would become the longest and most difficult day of his life. The interrogation room felt smaller with each passing minute. Marcus sat across from Detective Inspector Whitmore, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to explain himself. He told her about his social media channel, about the harmless pranks he usually pulled, about how he never meant any real harm or disrespect. His words tumbled out in a desperate rush. But the detective's expression remained unchanged throughout his explanation. Detective Whitmore made notes on her tablet, occasionally asking clarifying questions in a tone that suggested she had heard similar excuses many times before. She asked about his planning process, how long he had been in London, whether he had researched the legal implications of his actions. Each question made Marcus feel smaller and more foolish. He had researched camera angles and lighting, but not once had he considered the actual legal consequences of throwing liquid at a military guard. After nearly an hour of questioning, Detective Whitmore left the room, taking Marcus's passport and phone with her. A uniformed officer remained by the door, standing silently, while Marcus sat alone with his spiraling thoughts. He wondered if his family back in Toronto knew what had happened yet. He wondered if he would be deported, banned from entering the UK again, or worse, sentenced to jail time in a foreign country. The coffee stunt that was supposed to take 30 seconds had now consumed hours of his life. The ordeal was far from over. Time moved strangely in that windowless room. Marcus had no way to check his watch, which had been taken along with his other belongings. He estimated that another hour had passed before the door opened again. But this time, it was not Detective Whitmore who entered. It was a tall man in military dress uniform, with medals on his chest and insignia that Marcus did not recognize but which clearly indicated high rank. The officer introduced himself as Colonel Andrew Hartley, and his presence immediately made the atmosphere in the room even more serious. He sat down across from Marcus with a deliberate slowness that commanded respect. His expression was stern but not cruel, the face of someone who had seen many things and was not easily impressed or deceived. Marcus instinctively sat up straighter, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. "Colonel." Hartley began by explaining something that Marcus had not fully understood. The guard he had targeted was not just any serviceman. Corporal James Davidson was a decorated soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. It received a commendation for valor. It was currently assigned to ceremonial duties as both an honor and a recovery period after experiencing combat trauma. The coffee-stained uniform was not just cloth. It was a symbol of centuries of tradition, sacrifice, and national pride. The weight of this information hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had reduced a war veteran, a man who had risked his life for his country, to the butt of a joke for internet strangers. The shame that flooded through him was unlike anything he had felt before. This was not about breaking rules or getting in trouble. It was about the fundamental lack of respect and understanding he had shown for something far greater than himself. Colonel Hartley continued, his voice measured and firm. He explained that the King's Guard were not props for tourist entertainment. They were highly trained soldiers performing an important duty. Representing the monarchy and the military, with every moment, they stood at their posts. The expectation that they would remain unmoved by distractions was not a game or a challenge to tourists. It was a requirement of their role and a test of their discipline. Marcus found his voice, though it came out weak and strained. He apologized profusely, explaining that he truly had not understood the significance of what he was doing. He admitted that he had been foolish and selfish, thinking only about views and likes rather than about the real human being in that uniform. Tears welled in his eyes as the magnitude of his mistake fully registered. This was not content gone wrong. It was a genuine harm he had caused to someone who deserved respect, not ridicule. The colonel listened to Marcus's apology without interruption. When Marcus finished, there was a long pause. Colonel Hartley studied him carefully, perhaps trying to determine whether the remorse was genuine or simply a performance to reduce consequences. Finally, he spoke again. What he said surprised Marcus completely. The colonel explained that Corporal Davidson had been consulted about how he wished to proceed with the incident. Despite having every right to press for the maximum legal consequences, the corporal had made an unusual request. Instead of seeing Marcus prosecuted and jailed, he wanted to meet with him face to face. The corporal believed that education and understanding would serve a better purpose than punishment, at least in this case. However, this mercy came with conditions that Marcus would have to accept. Marcus nodded eagerly, willing to agree to almost anything that would help him make amends for what he had done. Colonel Hartley outlined the conditions carefully. First, Marcus would have to spend an entire day with the household division, learning about their history, their duties, and their sacrifices. He would meet with veterans, hear their stories, and understand what it truly meant to serve. Second, he would have to create a video about his experience, not for views or entertainment, but to educate others about respecting military personnel and historic institutions. Furthermore, Marcus would be required to make a formal public apology, not just to Corporal Davidson, but to the entire King's Guard and the institution they represented. He would have to delete his original footage and any posts related to the prank. A fine would be levied against him to cover the cost of replacing the damaged uniform and compensating for the disruption his actions had caused. Finally, he would be placed on a watch list, meaning any future visits to the UK would be monitored, and any similar behavior would result in immediate arrest and prosecution without mercy. Marcus agreed to every condition without hesitation. The alternative, he was told, was formal criminal charges that could result in up to 6 months in prison and a permanent criminal record that would affect his ability to travel internationally for the rest of his life. The choice was obvious, and Marcus was profoundly grateful that Corporal Davidson had shown him a compassion he absolutely did not deserve. Detective Whitmore returned to the room and formally cautioned Marcus, explaining the legal terms of the arrangement. He would be released that evening, but would be required to return the following morning at 7 to begin his day of education with the military. His passport would be held until he completed all requirements satisfactorily. Any deviation from the agreed terms would result in immediate prosecution. Marcus signed document after document, his hands still shaking, but his mind clear about what he needed to do. As the paperwork was completed, Colonel Hartley stood and delivered one final statement that would stay with Marcus forever. He said that the privilege of freedom and the luxury of making foolish mistakes for entertainment were gifts provided by people like Corporal Davidson, people who put themselves in harm's way so others could live safely. The least anyone could do was show them basic respect and dignity. Those words cut deeper than any punishment could have. Marcus was escorted out of the building as the evening was falling over London. The palace grounds were quieter now, with fewer tourists and a different set of guards on duty. He walked slowly back toward his hotel, his mind replaying the day's events over and over. The excitement he had felt that morning seemed like it belonged to a different person entirely. Someone naive and thoughtless who did not understand the real world beyond his phone screen. Back in his small hotel room, Marcus sat on the bed and stared at the wall. He thought about calling his parents but could not find the words to explain what had happened. He thought about his social media followers and realized that their numbers and comments had never actually mattered. What mattered was the real harm he could cause to real people in his pursuit of validation from strangers. It was a lesson he should have learned much earlier in life, but at least he was learning it now. Sleep did not come easily that night. Marcus lay awake thinking about Corporal Davidson, wondering what the man had experienced in Afghanistan, wondering how difficult it must have been to stand there with coffee dripping down his uniform and maintain his composure. He thought about the choice the corporal had made to offer education instead of demanding punishment, and he felt a deep gratitude mixed with shame. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. The next morning would bring new understanding, new perspectives, and a fundamental shift in how Marcus viewed respect, duty, and the responsibility that came with having a platform to reach others. But for now, in the quiet darkness of his hotel room, he simply accepted that he had been completely unprepared for the consequences of his actions, and that his life had changed in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. Marcus arrived at the Wellington barracks at 10 minutes before 7 in the morning, determined not to give anyone a reason to question his commitment to making amends. The historic building stood imposing in the early light, its architecture speaking of centuries of military tradition. A young officer met him at the entrance, checking his identification against a list before escorting him through security and into the heart of the facility. The officer, Lieutenant Rebecca Mills, explained the day's schedule as they walked through corridors, lined with photographs and memorabilia from various military campaigns. Marcus would begin with a presentation about the history of the King's Guard, followed by meetings with several service members who would share their experiences. After lunch, he would observe training exercises and learn about the physical and mental demands placed on ceremonial guards. The day would conclude with his meeting with Corporal Davidson. The first session took place in a small briefing room where a military historian, Captain Edward Green, presented a comprehensive overview of the Household Division's 500-year history. Marcus learned that the tradition of guards at royal palaces began in the 16th century, evolving from a genuine need for protection into both a functional security measure and a symbol of continuity and national identity. The uniforms, the ceremonies, the unwavering discipline, all of it carried meaning that stretched back through generations. Captain Green showed photographs and video footage from various eras, explaining how the guards had maintained their traditions even during wartime. During World War II, he explained, guardsmen had continued their ceremonial duties while also preparing for combat deployment. Many had served with distinction in battle and returned to their posts at the palace, carrying both the weight of their experiences and the honor of their role. The presentation made clear that these were not actors or performers. They were soldiers fulfilling an ancient and respected duty. After the presentation, Marcus was introduced to Sergeant Major Thomas Wright, a veteran with 26 years of service who had performed ceremonial duties early in his career. The Sergeant Major was a large man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see right through any pretense. He invited Marcus to sit in his office, a space filled with commendations and photographs from deployments around the world. Sergeant Major Wright spoke plainly about the pride and responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. He explained that when a guardsman stood at his post, he represented every person who had worn that uniform before him. Every sacrifice made in service to the nation, every value that the military embodied. To disrespect that uniform, even unknowingly, was to disrespect all of those people and all of that history. His words were not angry, but they carried an emotional weight that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. The sergeant major then shared his own story of serving in Iraq during the intense combat operations of the early 2000s. He described the responsibility of leading young soldiers, some barely out of their teens, into dangerous situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. He spoke about friends he had lost, about the difficulty of returning to normal life after experiencing trauma, about the brotherhood that formed between people who had faced the worst together. His voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the emotion behind his eyes. When the sergeant major finished speaking, he asked Marcus a direct question that cut to the heart of the matter. He asked what Marcus thought entertainment was worth compared to a human life, compared to someone's dignity, compared to the sacrifice people made for their country. Marcus had no good answer. He could only apologize again and admit that he had never thought about any of those things when planning his prank. The sergeant major nodded slowly, seeming satisfied that the message was getting through. The morning continued with more conversations. Marcus met with a young guardsman named Private Lewis, who was just 21 years old and had recently completed his initial training. Private Lewis explained the physical demands of standing at attention for hours, the mental focus required to maintain composure regardless of weather conditions or tourist behavior, and the pride he felt in carrying on the tradition. He also talked about his nervousness about an upcoming deployment to Eastern Europe, where he would be doing very different but equally important work. Lunch was served in the enlisted dining facility, where Marcus sat among service members of various ranks, listening to their casual conversations about training schedules, upcoming ceremonies, and weekend plans. The normalcy of it struck him powerfully. These were regular people with families, hobbies, worries, and dreams. They were not characters in a video or props for content creation. They were individuals who had chosen to serve something larger than themselves, and they deserved to be seen and respected as such. After lunch, Lieutenant Mills took Marcus to observe a training session where guards practiced their precise marching formations and coordinated movements. The level of discipline and attention to detail was remarkable. Every step was measured, every turn executed with perfect timing, every aspect of the performance refined through countless hours of practice. Marcus watched young recruits being corrected by their instructors, the feedback firm but constructive, focused on bringing out excellence rather than tearing anyone down. Lieutenant Mills explained that the ceremonial aspects of the role were just one part of a guardsman's duties. These same soldiers also trained for combat operations, security details, and emergency responses. The bearskin hat and red tunic were worn with pride, but underneath were warriors prepared to face much more serious challenges than tourist pranks. The dual nature of their role required a unique combination of showmanship and genuine military capability. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus was shown the equipment room where uniforms were meticulously maintained. A uniformed staff member explained the cost and craftsmanship involved in each piece. From the specially made bearskin hats to the hand-tailored tunics, the coffee-stained uniform that Marcus had damaged was there, being assessed for whether it could be cleaned or would need complete replacement. The actual monetary cost was shocking, but Marcus understood now that the true value went far beyond money. The day's most difficult moment came when Marcus was taken to meet several veterans from recent conflicts who were now involved in training and support roles. These men and women shared stories that were sometimes difficult to hear. They spoke about injuries, both physical and psychological, that they carried from their service. They described the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life, of dealing with memories that would not fade, of finding purpose after experiencing the intensity of combat. One veteran, a former corporal named Sarah Jenkins, spoke about losing her leg in an explosion in Afghanistan. She explained how the support of her fellow soldiers had helped her through rehabilitation, and how she now worked to support other wounded veterans. She showed no bitterness or self-pity, only determination and pride in her service. When she asked Marcus what he thought would happen if people understood these stories better, he answered honestly that the world would probably treat military personnel with far more respect and consideration. As the afternoon turned to evening, Marcus was taken to a quiet office where Corporal James Davidson was waiting. This was the moment Marcus had been both anticipating and dreading all day. The corporal stood when Marcus entered, and they shook hands formally. Davidson was younger than Marcus had expected, probably only in his early 30s. With a calm demeanor that suggested strength held in reserve, they sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. Finally, Corporal Davidson broke the silence. He explained that he had chosen to meet with Marcus not because he had forgiven him easily, but because he believed in giving people the opportunity to learn and grow from their mistakes. He admitted that his first reaction had been anger. Standing there with coffee soaking through his uniform while maintaining his required composure. But later, after his shift ended, he had thought about the young tourist who clearly had not endured what he was doing. Corporal Davidson shared some of his own story. He talked about joining the military at 18, about serving in Afghanistan, and witnessing things that changed him forever. He spoke about friends who had not come home, about the guilt of surviving when others had not, about the difficulty of finding normalcy after experiencing constant danger. His ceremonial duty with the King's Guard, he explained, was both an honor and a form of therapy, a way to serve while also processing his experiences in a more peaceful environment. He told Marcus that the discipline required to stand motionless despite provocations was not just tradition. It was a valuable mental skill that helped him manage his trauma responses. Every tourist who tried to make him flinch or break character was unknowingly testing a coping mechanism that helped him function in daily life. Marcus listened with growing horror at the layers of harm his thoughtless prank could have caused, not just to the uniform but to the man inside it. Corporal Davidson then said something that surprised Marcus completely. He thanked him for accepting the educational alternative to prosecution. He explained that he hoped Marcus would take what he had learned and share it with others, particularly young people who live their lives through social media without understanding the real-world impact of their actions. He said that if even a few people learned to think more carefully about respect and consequences, then something positive would have come from an otherwise negative situation. Marcus struggled to find adequate words to express his remorse and gratitude. He apologized fully and sincerely, acknowledging not just that he had broken rules, but that he had failed to see the humanity and sacrifice represented by the uniform. He promised that he would fulfill every condition of his agreement and that he would work to be a better person going forward. Corporal Davidson accepted his apology with a nod, and they shook hands again before parting. As Lieutenant Mills escorted Marcus out of the barracks that evening, he felt fundamentally changed. The day had stripped away his superficial understanding of the world and replaced it with something more substantial and meaningful. He had met real heroes, heard real stories of sacrifice, and understood real consequences. The education he received was worth far more than any punishment could have provided. And he knew he would carry these lessons for the rest of his life, the weeks following. Marcus's day at Wellington Barracks were unlike any he had experienced before. Back in his London hotel room, he spent long nights drafting and redrafting the video he had agreed to create. Unlike his previous content, which he could produce in an hour or two with quick edits and catchy music, this video required careful thought about every word and image. He wanted to honor the stories he had heard and convey the lessons he had learned without making the video about himself or seeking sympathy. Marcus reached out to Colonel Hartley and requested permission to interview some of the service members he had met, wanting to include their voices rather than just his own narrative. The colonel approved the request but assigned Lieutenant Mills to supervise all filming to ensure nothing was misrepresented. Over the course of a week, Marcus conducted respectful interviews with Sergeant Major Wright, Private Lewis, and Sarah Jenkins, the veteran who had lost her leg in Afghanistan. Each of them agreed to share their perspectives on military service and the importance of public respect. The editing process was painstaking. Marcus reviewed every frame, every transition, every word of narration. He consulted with Lieutenant Mills regularly, accepting her feedback on tone and content. He removed anything that seemed self-serving or attempted to paint himself as more enlightened than he actually was. The goal was not to rehabilitate his image, but to educate others so they would not make the same mistakes he had made. This required a level of humility that Marcus had never practiced in his content creation before. While working on the video, Marcus also drafted his formal public apology. He wrote multiple versions, showing each to both his hotel concierge, who had become a friendly confidant, and to Lieutenant Mills during their meetings. The apology needed to acknowledge specific harms, accept full responsibility without excuses, and demonstrate genuine understanding of why his actions were wrong. After the seventh draft, Lieutenant Mills finally approved it as sufficiently sincere and comprehensive. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus was called back to Wellington Barracks for a final review before his video and apology could be published. He sat in a conference room with Colonel Hartley, Lieutenant Mills, and a media relations officer from the Ministry of Defense. They watched his 20-minute video in complete silence. The video began with Marcus explaining what he had done, showing blurred security, footage of the incident with his own voice narrating his thoughtless intentions. The video then transitioned to the stories of the service members he had interviewed. Sergeant Major Wright spoke about the pride and responsibility of wearing the uniform. Private Lewis explained the training and discipline required for ceremonial duties. Sarah Jenkins shared her experience of injury and recovery, emphasizing that military service involved real risks and real sacrifices. Each segment was filmed with respect and care, allowing these individuals to speak their truth without dramatization or manipulation. The final portion of the video showed Marcus reflecting on what he had learned. He spoke directly to his audience about the difference between harmless entertainment and actions that disrespect people who serve their communities and countries. He challenged viewers to think critically about the content they created and consumed, to consider the human beings affected by pranks and stunts, and to choose kindness and respect over viral fame. His words were measured and sincere, coming from a place of genuine transformation rather than performative regret. When the video ended, there was a long pause before anyone spoke. Colonel Hartley broke the silence first, saying that the video exceeded his expectations and successfully conveyed the intended message. The media relations officer agreed, noting that the personal stories and Marcus's obvious growth would likely resonate with young audiences. Lieutenant Mills, who had worked most closely with Marcus throughout the process, simply nodded her approval with what might have been the hint of a smile. Marcus's formal apology was published first, posted on his social media channels and sent to several UK news outlets who had covered the original incident. The apology was straightforward and comprehensive, naming Corporal Davidson specifically and extending regrets to the entire household division, the military community, and anyone who had been disappointed by his behavior. He included no justifications, no requests for forgiveness, and no deflection of blame. The responses were mixed, with some people appreciating his accountability and others remaining skeptical of his sincerity. 2 days later, Marcus published the educational video. He titled it "The Day I Learned Respect, a Confession and a Lesson," and pinned a comment directing viewers to charities supporting military veterans. Unlike his usual content, he disabled monetization for the video, not wanting to profit from his mistake in any way. He also removed all of his previous prank videos from his channel, replacing them with a simple statement that he was rethinking his approach to content creation. The video's reception was more positive than Marcus had expected. Many viewers, particularly those with military backgrounds or family members in service, commented that they appreciated his willingness to learn and change. Some shared their own stories of military service or explained how civilian pranks had affected them or their loved ones. The video reached audiences beyond his usual followers, being shared by veterans organizations and educational groups. Focused on digital citizenship and social media responsibility, traditional media outlets picked up the story as well, framing it as a cautionary tale about influencer culture and a rare example of genuine accountability. Marcus gave several interviews to news programs. He was always careful to redirect attention away from himself and toward the service members who had taught him these lessons. In every appearance, he emphasized that he was not a hero for learning basic respect. He was simply someone who had made a terrible mistake and been given an undeserved opportunity to make it right. A month after the incident, Marcus returned to Wellington Barracks one final time. He had completed all the requirements of his agreement, and his passport was being returned to him. Colonel Hartley personally handed over the document, along with official documentation showing that the matter was resolved and that Marcus would not face criminal prosecution. However, the colonel reminded him that he was still on the watch list and would be monitored during any future visits to the UK. Any hint of similar behavior would result in immediate legal action. Before leaving, Marcus asked if he could meet Corporal Davidson one more time to thank him personally for the second chance. The corporal agreed and met Marcus in the same office where they had spoken weeks earlier. This conversation was shorter, but no less meaningful. Marcus expressed his gratitude and shared how the experience had changed his entire approach to life and content creation. Corporal Davidson seemed genuinely pleased with Marcus's progress and wished him well in his future endeavors. As Marcus prepared to return to Canada, he reflected on how drastically his priorities had shifted. The follower count that had once consumed his thoughts now seemed irrelevant. The pursuit of viral moments that had driven his travel plans now felt hollow and misguided. Instead, he found himself thinking about purpose, responsibility, and the kind of person he wanted to be. The coffee prank that was supposed to launch his channel to new heights had instead launched him into a complete reevaluation of his values and goals. Back in Toronto, Marcus faced the difficult task of explaining to his family and friends what had happened. His parents were initially angry and disappointed, but after watching his educational video and seeing the genuine changes in their son, they expressed pride in how he had handled the aftermath of his mistake. His friends had mixed reactions, with some supporting his growth and others distancing themselves from someone who had become temporarily internet infamous for the wrong reasons. Marcus made the difficult decision to step back from social media content creation for several months. He needed time to figure out what kind of message he wanted to share with the world and whether he was ready to use a public platform responsibly. During this break, he volunteered with a local veterans organization, listening to stories and supporting community events. He also enrolled in a college course on media ethics, wanting to understand the broader implications of digital content creation. When Marcus eventually returned to making videos, his content had completely transformed. Instead of pranks, he created educational videos about history, culture, and social responsibility. He interviewed veterans, first responders, teachers, and other people who served their communities in various ways. His audience changed as well, with many of his original prank-loving followers departing, but being replaced by people interested in more meaningful content. His channel grew more slowly, but felt more authentic and sustainable. The coffee incident became a defining moment in Marcus's life. Referenced frequently in his content as a reminder of how easy it is to cause harm when we prioritize entertainment over empathy. He used his experience as a teaching tool, speaking at schools and community events about digital citizenship, respect for institutions, and the real-world consequences of online behavior. Many young people connected with his story because he openly acknowledged his failures rather than pretending to have always understood these concepts. Years later, Marcus would maintain occasional contact with Lieutenant Mills and even Corporal Davidson, updating them on his ongoing efforts to promote respect and responsibility in online spaces. The connections he had made during the worst day of his life had somehow transformed into relationships that reminded him of his capacity for growth and change. The people who had every reason to punish him had instead invested in his education, and he worked daily to honor that investment. The tourist who had thoughtlessly thrown coffee at a royal guardsman for laughs had become an advocate for treating all people, especially those in service to others, with dignity and consideration. The viral moment he had sought so desperately had arrived, but not in any way he could have anticipated. His story spread not because it was funny or shocking, but because it demonstrated that accountability, humility, and genuine change were Still possible even in an age of performative apologies and hollow gestures. Marcus often thought about what might have happened if Corporal Davidson had chosen prosecution instead of education. He likely would have spent time in a UK jail, been deported with a criminal record, and carried resentment rather than understanding. Instead, he had been given the gift of perspective, the opportunity to meet remarkable people, and the chance to become someone who contributed positively to the world rather than merely entertaining it. That gift was something he could never fully repay, but he could spend his life honoring it through his choices and actions. The lesson Marcus learned that day outside Buckingham Palace was simple but profound. Every person we encounter has a story, a life, and a dignity that deserves respect. The uniforms people wear, whether military, police, medical, or any other service, represent commitments and sacrifices that should be honored rather than mocked. The pursuit of attention and entertainment should never come at the expense of basic human decency. And when we fail to live up to these standards, the most important thing we can do is acknowledge our failures honestly and work to do better. In the end, Marcus's story was not about a prank gone wrong. It was about the unexpected journey from thoughtlessness to understanding, from seeking validation to finding purpose, and from making one of the worst mistakes of his life to becoming someone capable of helping others avoid similar mistakes. The coffee that splashed across a guard's uniform that October morning had washed away more than just Marcus's plans for viral fame. It had washed away his illusions about what mattered in life. And what remained was something far more valuable than any number of views or likes could ever provide.